Right. So chapters 10 and 11 deal with evolution. We said we're moving in that direction when we're talking about genetics and how traits are carried on to their offspring. Okay. So today, now I was taking a look at this morning and I gasped. It says we have 10 pages of notes. Yikes, that's a lot of notes. But there's a lot of diagrams. Okay, so take heart in that. And also, we have a lot of objectives for this chapter, or these chapters. And that's what we'll start off with today. Okay. So the official objectives, we're going to talk about Charles Darwin. And he developed a theory of evolution. Now, he did this based on the theories of other people and really combined what their observations were with his own observations to come up with this theory of evolution. This wasn't just some random idea that he picked out of thin air. There is a lot of evidence for evolution. And that's where in our notes we're going to have some pictures to show us some examples of this evidence. Darwin proposed that natural selection was the mechanism for evolution. Natural selection is kind of that idea of survival of the fittest. So on Double Block Day, we'll be doing a lab about natural selection. We'll also talk about microevolution, so evolution on a smaller scale. And how that affects a population's gene pool, and the gene pool is all the genes in a population. And then we can conclude with applying evolutionary biology to health science. When we hear things like about bacteria being resistant to antibiotics, that's all about evolution. How are the bacteria changing? And remember, going way back at the beginning, we talked about our goals for the year and the themes that we were going to talk about throughout the year. That we said evolution simply means change. And so we're going to talk more about that too. What are we talking about here? We're not starting from a single-celled organism. We're just talking about changes. So those are the official objectives of the chapters. But there are some things, once again, like we did with chapter 8, there are some things that I want you to kind of keep your ears open for as we're talking about all this science. So once again, we're going to start by focusing on the people. What contributions did they make to the theory of evolution? As I said, Darwin pulled from a lot of different scientists to come up with his theory. And then when did they do it? And once again, this is just a relative time. I'll give you dates, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for many of them. When we talk about Darwin, there will be some important dates that you'll need to know. But for the most part, we're just trying to get an idea of when in history is this stuff happening. Darwin. Who was this guy? So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about Darwin and his life leading up to his theories of evolution. He has some kind of sordid details in his life that are kind of fun. And of course, ultimately, it's his theory of evolution that we're concerned with. So since we said his means of evolution was natural selection, we'll talk more about natural selection. And when we talk about natural selection, we'll also talk about artificial selection, which is when we choose the traits we want an organism to have. I mentioned there is evidence for evolution, so we'll take a look at some pieces of evidence that show that organisms have changed through time. And then on that microevolution side, we'll take a look at factors that cause changes in gene pools. Things like Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. This is a theory that under the right circumstances, we can apply a little bit of math and we can see how gene pools have changed over time. So we'll take a look at that. We'll talk about genetic drift. I like talking about genetic drift when we have shadows. It's perfect because they're an example of genetic drift when they come visit us. But they're probably not going to work out since our weeks are so messed up. All right, gene flow. We'll revisit mutations. And then, as we said in the first list of objectives, we'll take a look at real-world examples of evolution occurring. Right. So on with the notes. So we said we have 10 pages of notes. We're already on page 4. So it's not quite as daunting as it first looks like. And actually we're to the end of page 4, and now we're on page 5. So today we're going to take a look at history and take a look at some of these people that contributed to what Darwin ultimately put all together. So we're going way back to Aristotle. And the reason why we mention Aristotle is because his beliefs were prevalent for hundreds of years. And so Aristotle believed that species, he wouldn't have used that term species, we don't have that term yet, but that's what he was talking about, that species are fixed. Now by fixed, I don't mean like when you get your dog or cat fixed, that's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is that they're unchanging. So this was the prevailing belief as we fast forward all the way up to Linnaeus. Now we actually have talked about Linnaeus before because Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy. So Linnaeus developed a classification system for the known organisms of his time. He developed a classification system for the known organisms of his time. He classified the organisms based on their similarities. So this is that whole thing we did way back with the kingdom, phylum, etc., down to genus, species. Now notice I started at kingdom, I did not start at domain. He did not do the domain thing. He started with kingdom and went down through species. So getting more and more specific as you go down the taxonomy. And we, of course, still use this taxonomy. So his definition of a species was two organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Definition of species is two organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. So their offspring are capable of reproducing as well. So we mentioned before, this is not a perfect definition. He was dealing with organisms that sexually reproduce. But if you're looking at bacteria, for instance, that reproduce asexually, this doesn't work. I How do we tell the difference between species then? They reproduce by themselves. Or we also have things like, okay, so we have a horse and a donkey, we cross them, they can produce offspring. What do they produce? Horse and a donkey. A mule. Mules are not fertile. If you put two mules together, you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get any more mules. You're not going to get anything. They're infertile. So then, what species is mule? It's its own little thing. I don't know. It doesn't fit into its definition because they can't reproduce. They're not fertile. Okay. So there are some problems with it, but we still use it anyway. It's all good. Interesting thing with ligers. So lion and tiger cross, you get a liger. Ligers, if they live long enough, can reproduce and make more ligers. But the problem is they don't usually live to reproductive age. Their bodies are so kind of odd that they don't live to reproductive age, so they never end up reproducing. Georges Louis Leclerc, Le Comte de Buffon. It's a mouthful. The truth is that this first part is his actual name, Le Comte de Buffon. He was the Count of Buffon. That's what that part means. Silly thing. Usually, we just refer to him as Buffon. Don't even refer to him by his actual name. His thought was that some animals have changed since their creation. So we're going against Aristotle now. He's saying, no, that's not true. They do change. So some animals have changed since their creation. He was also a proponent of the thought that the earth is more than 6,000 years old. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So since he and Linnaeus were like living at the same time, were they like in two different places?
Yes, they were.
Okay.
Yes, they were. Georges Cuvier. Georges Cuvier was a paleobiologist. So paleobiology is the study of ancient organisms. And so one of the things that he noticed in his research was that the deeper you go into the earth, the more different organisms are from currently living organisms. The deeper you go into the earth, the more different the organisms are than currently living organisms. But that being said, observing that, he did not believe in change. He did not believe that organisms change through time. He believed in extinctions. So he thought basically that those organisms, those deep organisms that were different from the organisms that are around today, the only reason they're not around today is because they went extinct. We were there then too, but they went extinct and we didn't. So we're here, still here, and they're not. Something fishy about that. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Lamarck was known for a lot of different things, and some of the things he was known for were kind of fishy. But a couple of things that were important, at least at this point. His thought in 1809 is when he kind of announced this thought. His thought was that organisms are evolving, but they're evolving toward perfection and complexity. I would love to know what his definition of perfection was, but that I do not know. So organisms are evolving towards perfection and complexity. His other theory, and this is my favorite of his theories, is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. What this means is that any characteristics that you gain in your life, you acquire during your lifetime, will be passed on to your offspring. Any characteristics you gain during your lifetime, you will pass off to your offspring. So this would be, I mean, he was talking, and I'll give you a natural example of like what he would have thought. But Sophia, I'm going to pick on you for a second. So in this case, in this scenario, under inheritance of acquired characteristics, Sophia goes and bleaches her hair, so bleach blonde. According to this, her offspring then will have blonde hair. Is that going to happen? No. No, that's not going to happen. So the way he did it, he said it was like things like giraffes. The reason why giraffes have long necks is some of the giraffes were able to stretch their necks to get the food, and since they stretched their necks, their offspring had longer necks. No. That's not how it works. But it's a fun theory. And actually Darwin put this in his work too, so we'll come back to that. And Darwin, finally Charles Darwin. And we're actually going to stop with notes here. We'll talk about Darwin tomorrow because I have quite a bit to say about him. So. Notice that the year Lamarck was coming up with these kind of off ideas That was the same year that Darwin was born.